everyone. So awesome to be here. I've been here as an attendee for a few years, but it looks a little bigger from this stage, absolutely. So first off, I'm happy to see that people are interested in what it takes to stay in control of your company as a founder for the long run. Tradeshift, we are around 10 years old. We obviously have some lessons from that journey and have not always gone the route that everybody else have done. So I hope you'll enjoy that with me as well. So really, a little bit about my story and our story. I come from Denmark, that's why I have an accent. We are a lot of SaaS companies, by the way, from Denmark, if you haven't noticed. Mikkel Svane was here earlier speaking. And we went from Denmark to Unicorn here in Silicon Valley in around 8 years. I'll talk a little bit about that journey. So we do something incredibly boring. So supply chains are complex, they're expensive, but they also have that small thing where they make the whole world economy go round. So it's typically dominated by companies like Oracle, SAP. It's very, very complicated, and it's something you only really hear about in the news if it ever goes terribly wrong. That's awesome because we love complexity. We have a background doing software and standards for trade, and we thought that there's a massive opportunity in this space. And we really wanted to simplify supply chains. We looked at the world in 2008, 2009, and we said, how come it's almost impossible to connect two companies to do business, especially if they have complex business processes, but we can all connect as consumers on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, every single day we want to do business. So we wanted to create essentially what you can probably describe the easiest way as an anti-SAP of supply chains. Something that was easy, simple, free to use, open, and easy to develop for. So what is Tradeshift really? Well, it is, if you took LinkedIn, combined it with the app platform from Salesforce, and used and looked at the domain, which is supply chains. So where Salesforce essentially is a company that serves everything between you and your customers, you can think about Tradeshift as a 180 of that. We are a company for everything between you and your suppliers. And just like Salesforce, we have a platform, so third parties are developing apps for our platform. But unlike Salesforce, we also have a huge network connecting all of those suppliers, multiple tiers down all over the world. So that's what we do. We are heavily focused, as I said again, on doing things that are simple, that are easy to use. We take complexity out. Most of you who ever have done enterprise sales, you know enterprise sales are spreadsheet driven. You get into an RFP, there's a long list of features, and the guy with the longest list of features for the lowest amount of money wins typically the bid. Except it's probably very often rigged to begin with, so they already know who they want as the winner. We've gone the other way. We're actually taking features out. We very frequently advertise to our customers we have less features in the UI. Around 60% of enterprise software features are never used. So as a customer, you just pay for maintaining them. And really go say, what about having software that you can roll out fast, easily, and drive high conversion inside your supply chain? This is not an advertisement of Tradeshift. I just want to make sure you understand what we do and how we compete with companies like SAP on a daily basis. We have 3 core products. Tradeshift Buy, which is essentially what we call private marketplaces. So think about it like Amazon or eBay, but instead of being you and I, it is the Fortune 500 companies of this world that use it. Companies like Unilever going and buying produce, enzymes, ingredients on our private marketplace technology. We have Tradeshift Pay. Tradeshift Pay is an end-to-end payment solution for supply chains, meaning no matter where your supplier is in the world, we can make sure they get paid. And again, to make it very simple, think about that just like a PayPal, but for the enterprise, for the Fortune 500 in the world. And then finally, we have apps, which is just like Force.com. It's an app platform for third-party developers to develop software for the supply chain and to get access to hundreds and hundreds of customers and to thousands and thousands and actually millions of sellers. So that's all about us, and I'll talk a little bit more about our journey, right? So in Tradeshift, we always had big ambitions, and we always knew as a company we would become big. And in fact, as true entrepreneurs, we had this idea. We wanted to start the company in a garage. That was simply something we had to do. So this is a picture from the garage in Denmark 8 years ago. And as you can see, we had very big ambitions. We already had a world map up with like pins of where we had customers. This is within the first few weeks. And obviously, we are also doing what you got to do when you have a SaaS company. We are on the phone selling our software before we even really begun to get the first few customers in and figure out what do they really need. But there's just one problem with being in a garage in Denmark, and that is, unlike Silicon Valley, it's pretty cold in the winter. So we also knew within the first 12 months that to win in our market and to be the very best in our category, we needed to leave Denmark. Denmark is a small country. We only have 5 million people. We were never really focused on serving the Danish market. We were focused on serving the global market. And you know, from when I was a kid, it's like, yes, we got to go to the US. We're going to win in the US because that is where all supply chains end and most of the purchasing power is. So I called up my good friend, Mikkel Svane, and I said, hey, Mikkel, we're thinking about going to the US and we don't know if we should go to the East Coast or the West Coast. And he said, and they just came, I mean, Zendesk at that point in time had just arrived in San Francisco. They moved to Boston first. And Mikkel, he goes, Christian, Boston is as far away from Silicon Valley as Denmark and as cold in the winter. So that pretty much sort of made the decision. And I know right now, and the reason I'm mentioning all of this is, there's a lot of discussions right now. Should you be in San Francisco? Should you be Silicon Valley? Should you be somewhere else? I know a lot of you come from around the world, from around the country. And I think I have a very simple sort of view on that. And that is, you should only build a company in Silicon Valley or San Francisco if you think you can make it to be number one in that category. Because if not, you cannot afford the workforce, you cannot afford the real estate, you cannot afford to be here. You're playing in the Premier League of the world when it comes to cloud, when it comes to SaaS, when it comes to AI. And that means if you're not number one, the power law that Peter Thiel talks a lot about is going to kick your ass harder here than anywhere else in the world. Now, I do think that Peter Thiel is actually wrong when it comes to the power law, because it's completely okay to be number 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7 in SaaS, especially in B2B, but then you should just not be in San Francisco. I think most markets, especially in enterprise space, they tend to fragment over time. And even in consumer, it's not really holding out, right? Because we still have a Facebook, a Twitter, a Snapchat, an Instagram, and all of these sort of fragmented properties. So the idea that there can only be one winner, I think we should start forgetting a little bit about. There can be many, many winners when you have compounding interest from users and from services, and I'll talk a lot more about that. So what is it that worked really well for the business of Tradeshift through our journey, right? So we sell enterprise SaaS software. We go to our customers, we say, hey, would you like a cloud platform to run your supply chain? We can do the private marketplaces, we can do the payments, and we have all of these third-party app providers. So the first thing that worked really, really well for us was complexity. So complexity is awesome. Complexity is something that you're taught, and I think most founders are learning, is you should focus, you should only do one thing, you should do one thing really, really well. That holds true for consumer. And that holds true for some use cases within business, especially if you're doing small deals repeatedly at a fast rate. But if you're doing something that's hard, that has its own advantages. Some of the advantages is, you know, it will take a long time for us to close a customer. But once we close the customer, we don't churn them. In the history of Tradeshift, we've churned 2 customers, both before go live. So we essentially have a saying that is, if our customers go live, we won't churn them. Because the stickiness of the complexity of rolling out in 190 countries, setting up tax compliance, managing really, really complicated B2B processes is very, very high. It also drives for high ACV. Our average ACV is 500K, and it's increasing with around 20% quarter over quarter. And the reason for that is also very simple. What we do is very complicated, but once we're in, we can extract a high value for our work, and we tend to get more and more trust from our customers to do more. It also means that we win more value for every engagement our salespeople have. Where a normal sales guy, he might need to go and hit up 5 customers to make 500K, we can get that out of one cycle. And the difference between selling 500K and 100K is not that different in time. So I think it was Tom Tungus from Redpoint who said, whenever you're in doubt, about product market fit, just double your price. And if the customer is still buying, you have more room to go and your product has value for them. And if they tell you no, you need to iterate on product market fit until you can do that again. It's also a huge moat for competitors. I mean, there's not that many founders in the world that's interested in doing global tax compliance for, let's say, invoicing. So that's fantastic. Whereas everybody is looking at, let's say, Instagram in the early days and say, oh wow, we can do an Instagram too, or we can do an XYZ, or maybe as Snapchat learned the hard way, Mark Zuckerberg could do a Snapchat too with Instagram stories, right? But we have huge moats for competitors. It's very hard to penetrate. So one piece of advice I would give to most founders is learn to love complexity, because moats, especially in enterprise, are fantastic when you look at complexity. It's costly. So one thing you better start practicing if you are in B2B and if you are in enterprise and you like complexity is your fundraising skills. We have raised around $400 million in the lifetime of Tradeshift. We have had months where our burn was easily above $10 million. When you put 20 Fortune 500 companies live in one quarter, that's what you'll encounter. And if you cannot soak up those capital costs, you're going to die very, very quickly. But on the other hand, if you can suck up those capital costs, you can outcompete most of your competitors just on raw capital. So I think this is something to be aware of. And also in the beginning, customer acquisition cost is very, very high. Going into, let's say, Unilever and selling Tradeshift is not really like convincing them to take a box trial. We're essentially going in and say, hey, how would you like to use our cloud software to run the one thing that's the most important for your whole business when it comes to deliver value and goods to your customers? So that takes some talking, that takes some convincing, that takes some time. So get used to having a much higher CAC in the early days. And that leads me sort of to the last point, and I think in SaaS really cannot be underlined enough, and I think most companies are probably under-investing in too late, and that is alliances. 50% of our revenue today comes from alliance partners. Any deal that comes from an alliance partner is half the time. It is a third of the CAC, and it's typically higher value. So we cannot invest too much money in our alliance channel. We today have alliances with all of the major system integrators. We have alliances with all of the major BPOs in the world. But alliances take 3 years to be efficient. So don't hire those alliance people and then evaluate after 12 months, where are you? Why haven't Accenture pushed out 20 deals for us yet? Accenture will make you work hard and long to earn your time with them. They will make you give them deals over and over and over. Don't be cheap. Do it. Give it to them. Come to them and say, even if you could have done the integration yourself, even if you have a professional services team, go and give it to your partners instead and say, hey, I have this integration for you, I have this project for you, because that's the way they build a bench. The advantage, again, for partnerships is also it drives a very, very high conversion rate. Our conversion rate is around 28% for late-stage deals in our funnel. It's roughly twice of the best practice standard for most sort of large-scale enterprise SaaS companies. So again, this is where alliances can make a real difference. So apart from the things that sort of worked well, and I think as a CEO or founder of any SaaS business you got to manage, I think there's one more thing that sort of is underestimated, and that is Tradeshift is a SaaS business, just like Salesforce, combined with a network just like LinkedIn. And networks, I think personally, are going to be the future of SaaS. So if we think about computing, we tend to think it went in 2 stages: on-premise, cloud. And especially in the enterprise, everybody says the journey is to cloud. How far is SAP to become a cloud company again? But if you look at consumer, I actually think it went in 3 stages. It went on-prem, and then we were on cloud for like a minute, and then we moved to networks. Do you guys remember we used to have consumer cloud apps that were not connected to networks? Like Picasa for your photos. Who in the world today would dream of uploading their photos where they couldn't share them, where they couldn't value add them, where they couldn't get likes, where they couldn't have social interaction. I think exactly the same is true for business. Cloud drives and builds networks for a very simple reason. It brings down the cost of connectivity. So when you're in the cloud, it's much cheaper to connect things, and that's where network value really increases very fast. And if you're in doubt, just look at some of the biggest bidding wars that have been in SaaS the last 24 months. The Microsoft Salesforce war over LinkedIn. Nadella, he's a very, very smart guy with what he's doing with Microsoft strategy right now. And I think he's actually kind of leapfrogging a lot of the newer SaaS companies with where they're going with this. So why are networks so powerful? Well, of course, we know network effects from the consumer space. But the enterprise space, if you combine network effects with stickiness and real value, if we connect two people on Facebook, the only way we can really sort of mine that relationship is advertising. If I connect two companies, the ways I can create value for that relationship are infinite. I can help you accelerate your payment. I can help you get insurance cheaper. I can help you get access to better logistics services. So I can actually add real value instead of just being sort of a leech on top of a connectivity model for friends. So networks are powerful. This is the compounding GMV of the Tradeshift network. Just last quarter, we ran $77 billion through the network of global trade. It's roughly around 3% of global trade, but at the current growth rate, we're going to be doing 10% next year. To give you a comparison metric, this is roughly 3 times what Amazon do in B2B. We are right now doing more cross-border traffic on trade of GMV between China and the world than Alibaba is. So when you have these network effects inside the enterprise, they are a lot slower, as you can see, to start compounding, but once they start compounding, they're a lot bigger and they're a lot stickier. All of this leads to a business model, which I think is sort of the emerging post-SaaS business model, which is really, you get SaaS enterprise customers like we do. They drive adoption among their users and their supply chain and their ecosystems. And the more users and the more ecosystem they build, the more app partners that attract for us who want to build on our platform. And the more app partners we have on our platform, the more deals we win because the more competitive we are in deal cycles versus standalone SaaS companies who only have their own offering. And we sort of make the comparison to say it's a little bit like the difference between SaaS 1.0 is a little bit like your Nokia feature phone. The SaaS provider will give you all of the services and all of the features, but if you want a new version, you got to wait for the next one. Whereas SaaS plus networks plus platform is a little bit like your smartphone. You buy a SaaS solution, but you can continuously upgrade and get access to new value through the platform part of it. And just to sort of see how deep these network effects drive, this is an example from the real world where we closed first a German company, DHL, then we got UPS, then we got FedEx, because what they all realized was the networks of sellers and their ecosystems are overlapping. So today we are onboarding more than 70% of freight forwarders in the world. And of course, our next thing is to go and find all of the right app partners to service the logistics industry and to bring value for these guys. And you know, if I was SAP, I would insist on building all of this myself. These old school companies, they want to build every single feature themselves, preferably in Germany, preferably in German. But instead, with an open model like ours, you can sort of harness the value of these ecosystems. So the flywheel in effect today, we run 150 of the Fortune 500 supply chains. We have 2.5 million sellers in 190 countries. I mentioned we do more cross-border traffic out of China than, for instance, Alibaba do. And it's on a very boring topic such as supply chain, so you probably never heard about us. But we're completely okay with that as long as the right 500 people in the world know who we are in a good spot. So that was sort of the whole speech about the journey of Tradeshift and why we are where we are today. But I want to sort of, especially since this is SaaStr, and this whole speech actually started with us announcing our funding round last year and Jason Lemkin pinging me on Twitter and say, hey, you should come and talk about how on earth you did that. And I'll talk about what that is in a second. When we announced our E round last year, we we, the founders, we co-invested. We had a fund, and we invested $50 million directly into that round as well ourselves. And in fact, what we didn't tell Jason is we actually bought for another $50 million of early stage and secondary stock and increased our stake. We almost doubled our stake in our E round, which is sort of breaking every formula there ever have been for how founders and ownership should behave in late stage rounds for big companies. So how come we could do that? And I think there's a number of reasons or lessons I would love to share, right? So we just raised our F round right now. We're sort of halfway through it. And the founders plus the early stage investors, we own 40% of the company. And that's on an F round versus $400 million of capital raised. So we're pretty happy with that. And I think one of the reasons is we never ever in the history of Tradeshift outsourced fundraising. Investment bankers are lovely, lovely people who will take control of your narrative. Your VC fundraising for you, you know the friendly VC you have on the board that says, oh, I'll help you pitch all the way up and down Sand Hill Road, I know everybody. They will take control of the narrative of you. You as a founder 100% got to own the narrative of your company. And you can never ever let go of the upside of that narrative, because at some point somebody will say, hey, why don't you pitch your story a little bit differently? Why don't you just cut out this whole thing about wanting to do an app platform? Our investors told us for 8 years, the fact that you want to do apps, Christian, is too complex. You should focus and just be a pure SaaS business, and that's the only way to do it. We insisted for 8 years that no, being an app platform was actually what would make us a company in the league of SAP and Oracle, and why we had a much bigger business potentially. And it's almost like when you test for a good customer, there's all of these blogs about find the right first customers. It's the same here. Find the right investors that buy into the big idea, not the small idea. And it might take a little longer. Secondly, time is your friend. I cannot tell you how many people who came up to me and said once we became a unicorn, hey Christian, when are you selling? When are you going to live on the beach? When are you going to get that house in Hawaii? Now you've done it, you made it. But the reality is it took Salesforce 10 years to go from 0 to 1 billion. And then it took another 10 years to go from 1 billion to 80 billion. Most founders think about selling at 1 billion. That's because they're bad at math. So late stage value in a SaaS company compounds 20 to 50 times more than early stage value. And most founders hand over most of that value to the VCs and the investors. So you got to rethink that, because that's sort of where it goes wrong. But you need to be willing to spend 20 years instead of 10 years building a company. That's the time investment you need to sacrifice. And why is this, right? This is because it's a pretty big secret. I know we love to sort of think we are very different in Silicon Valley. We are reinventing the world. We're doing the cloud. We're doing cool things like software. And we're all wearing sneakers, so we're a lot cooler than bankers. But the reality is that a SaaS business is essentially a bank. Subscriptions are like bonds. Every single time you get a subscription, you get a steady, recurring revenue stream that gets paid annually with a compounding return. And if you just manage your churn and you manage your revenue growth, and this machine works, it keeps going and it keeps going and keeps going. That's why Jason Lemkin is talking about who's the first next generation of 1 billion ARR companies. I don't think he's thinking big enough, because there will be $10 billion ARR companies and possibly also $100 billion, because that's the magic of compounding. So if you have subscriptions, you are the holder of bonds. You have acquired a massive amount of bonds, and those bonds are financial instruments that you can leverage. And if you think about it, right, what you're really owning is you're owning the best bank in the world. On average, a US Treasury bond deliver a return to the big pension funds of around 5%, 3 to 5% annually, right? If you beat that rate in your growth and subscriptions, every single pension fund in the world will take a call from you, because they have trillions of dollars that they need to place to generate a return from. Every single sovereign wealth fund, late stage, will take a call with you. And every single time you let your VC, or you let your financer, or you let your bank tell you that they should orchestrate that deal, you're handing over the compounding future of all of those bonds to somebody else. So what we did instead was we said, hey, we own all of these bonds. Let's talk to these pension funds who's normally buying US Treasury bonds and say, hey, we have a much better deal. So we said to them, guys, we want to cut out the VCs, we're going to cut out all of these people, and we want to buy more. So we want to stake our own shares. And we'll take all of our own holdings, we will bet them as security against a loan of $100 million. You'll give us $100 million, we will bet our shares. And since our shares was at that time worth quite a bit, it's roughly loan to value around 25% with these guys they're very comfortable with. So worst case for us is we lose 25% of our share value. Best case for us is we just doubled our holding of stock in the company. So remember that as a founder in a late-stage SaaS company, what you own is bonds, and you should market and sell them accordingly. You shouldn't trade the value. And essentially what we did is what most funds do in the world. They go out, they talk to their LPs, and they generate exactly the same deal with their LPs. So as a founder, you can go straight and you can do that today, and that's the wonderful thing about finance being commoditized. So that's really all for me today. I think for us, this has been a fantastic, fun journey. We are only 10 years in, so as you saw from my previous slide, we're really looking forward to the next 10 years. That's what it can get really fun. And I think if anyone have any questions, we can't do Q&A now, but I will be on the floor later, so you can come up and you can chat with me. So thank you so much for listening in.